The Amalfi Coast in southern Italy is one of the hottest travel destinations. I recently had the opportunity to visit Positano, which is one of the most popular towns along the Amalfi Coast. I had a fabulous time there, however, it was not without mistakes. I would like to share with you some tips for how to make the most out of your visit to the Amalfi Coast. Besides Positano, other towns that are most often visited along the Amalfi Coast are the towns of Amalfi, Priano, and Ravello. There are several other small towns and villages throughout the Amalfi Coast, but these are some of the most common ones that tourists tend to visit. Of note, though, there are also two other towns, Sorrento and Salerno, that are the two larger towns at either end of the Amalfi Coast. I've personally been to Sorrento twice now, and honestly, it's one of my favorite towns to visit on vacation because it's very convenient to reach it via train, and you can easily plan day trips via ferry or bus or taxi from Sorrento, and the hotel prices tend to be cheaper in Sorrento than the hotels that are along the Amalfi Coast. There are multiple ways to reach the Amalfi Coast. One of the most common ways people start in their journey to the Amalfi Coast is via the Rome International Airport. Once at the international airport, you can take the high-speed train to the Napoli Central Station, which takes about 50 minutes. I would definitely recommend booking the tickets in advance because the sooner you book the ticket or the further in advance you book the tickets, the cheaper they are. Because if you look at the trends on the ticket websites, the closer you are to the day of the trip, the more expensive the tickets tend to be. And there are tickets generally throughout the day. There's many different departures throughout the day, so you don't generally need to worry about it unless you're really traveling at peak times or maybe there's some sort of special event going on. There's two main train companies that operate this high-speed service. There is Trenitalia, which is the official train company of the country of Italy, sponsored by the government. Then there's the privately owned train company called Italo. They generally have pretty comparable prices. It can vary in terms of which one is more expensive or less expensive for a certain day or time. So I recommend definitely comparing the prices on these two different companies' websites and determining which would be the most suitable for you. There's also different classes of service available on the trains for both of these companies. Honestly, I feel like any seat is fine on either of these trains. There's not really a need to pay extra for a higher class of seats unless you really want to. The main difference is that the higher class of seating might give you slightly more legroom or width to the seat, maybe slight increase in comfort, and also some of these higher classes include drinks and a small snack, but they're kind of just like soft drinks that you might see on a flight. And the small snacks are generally like a small packet of cookies or chips or crackers. So not really a huge significant difference to really warrant a major cost difference in my opinion. If the cost difference is very minimal, maybe just a few euros, then it could warrant maybe an upgrade to a higher class, but otherwise, honestly, the most basic class of service should be enough and very comfortable. I highly recommend booking directly at one of these train companies' websites. They're very easy to use and very user-friendly. There's English versions for both of these websites, and so you can definitely manage to just book it yourself rather than potentially paying a surcharge if you use a different website that kind of services these booking websites. For Italo, I've noticed that they routinely have sales for their train tickets. And so if you are planning in advance, I would recommend potentially checking the website maybe 1 or 2 times a week to see if there might be a sale going on. The sales tend to last a couple of days at a time. It might be, like this, for example, screenshot shows up to 30% off on some of the train services. And so that could be a good way to save money. Of note, the cheapest class of tickets that you purchase on these trains tend to be non-refundable. You can pay more for a refundable ticket that's more flexible. Or my tip for you is that when you purchase the cheapest or lowest class service that's non-refundable, when you're actually going through the purchasing process, there is an option to add 1 or 2 euros per person or per ticket so that the ticket becomes partially refundable. And I've actually purchased the surcharge myself, and I've actually canceled a ticket while using this service that's offered as part of the surcharge to make it more refundable. So I had booked a lowest class ticket that was non-refundable, but during the purchasing process, I selected the option of paying, I think, 2 euros extra per ticket to make it refundable. So then later when I ended up canceling it because I found a better time that works for my schedule, when I canceled it, I wasn't able to get a 100% refund because the 2 euro per ticket surcharge is not refundable, as it states when you are purchasing that on the website. So I wasn't able to get the 2 euro per ticket refund, and also the refund ended up being, I believe, around 70% or so of the cost of the ticket. So while it's not 100% refundable, I thought was very worthwhile to pay that extra 2 euros per ticket to make it more flexible should my travel plans change. Here's a screenshot of what it might look like during a sale for the Italo train service. The sales generally are not for all trains that's operated by the company. It's limited usually by the date, and sometimes it's only for certain times during the day that the sale is applicable. So when you're looking for train tickets for a specific date or travel, you might notice during the sale, you might notice that there might be 20 services that day for that route, but only maybe half of them are part of the discount program that's going on. So on this screenshot, you can see that this evening train does have the promo that's applied to it so that you can save a couple more euros per ticket. So if you weren't landing in the Rome International Airport and instead you are landing in the Naples International Airport, you can skip that first step of trying to get from Rome to Napoli Central train station. So if you had landed at Naples International Airport, what you want to do is get from the airport via train, bus, taxi to the Napoli Central Station, just like before, and then take the Circumvesuviana train to Sorrento. So this process would be the same too if you're starting in Rome. So first you take the train from Rome to Napoli Central, then from Napoli Central you take the Circumvesuviana train to Sorrento. The tickets are very inexpensive on this train to Sorrento. It's only about 4 euros per person each way. It's not super fast in the sense that it takes 70 to 80 minutes or so in one direction, and that's because it stops at many different local stops along the way. Sorrento is the last stop, so don't worry, you won't miss getting off the train. Just wait until the very last stop, and obviously you can look for the signs that say Sorrento as the station. This Circumvesuviana train runs about every 30 to 60 minutes. You can just buy the tickets at the station. There's no need to purchase these tickets in advance because the tickets are the same price, whether you purchase it in advance or right before the train is supposed to depart. And there's no assigned seats or anything like that, so just more like first come, first serve. And I'm not familiar with the tickets selling out for this train, because you can really try to pack as many people as you can into the train because there's no assigned seats. And FYI, the train starts at the same station as Napoli Central, even though you might see that it's kind of technically starting at a different station. But when you get off the train at Napoli Central from Rome, just follow the signs for the Circumvesuviana line and you'll find it. It's only probably a 5 to 10 minute walk from the platform that you would get off at on Napoli Central to get to the platform for the Circumvesuviana train to Sorrento. There is an express train option that's available. It's called the Campania Express. That's more for tourists that want to head to Sorrento. That train has less stops, so it is faster, but it's also significantly more expensive, costing about 15 euros per person each way. Once you arrive in Sorrento, then there's multiple other options to get you directly onto the Amalfi Coast. So there's the bus, the ferry, or a taxi / private transfer or tour group. The Sita bus is definitely the most economical option for getting to the Amalfi Coast, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. The ferry I find to be more efficient and luxurious as a method of getting to the Amalfi Coast. There's many different companies that offer ferry service, especially during the peak tourist season. And there's many different ferry routes that are available. So for example, you can get from Sorrento to Positano, or Sorrento to Amalfi, or Sorrento to Capri Island, etc. It does cost more per ticket, and I'll talk about that a little bit more too. But you can view the schedule on ferryhopper.com to kind of see what the availability and the times and the prices are for these ferries. Taxi private transport tour group can definitely be an option too, although this is the most expensive version of these 3 travel options. For example, it can cost around 150 euros to get a taxi from the Napoli airport to Positano. I'm not sure how much it would cost to get from the Sorrento train station to Positano or another town on the Amalfi Coast, but just as a reference, I've heard it costing about 150 euros from the Napoli airport to Positano. If you are planning to take the Sita bus from Sorrento to the Amalfi Coast, there are some very important information to keep in mind. You must buy the tickets in advance from tobacco shops, which are called tabacchi in Italian, and they're usually labeled as such. So you can get them at tobacco shops or convenience stores, parking garages, or cafes. You can purchase the Sita bus tickets for 10 euros for a 24-hour ticket, which can be very helpful if you're planning to take the bus several times in 24 hours. Or you can pay $2.20 for one-way tickets. I have personally witnessed the bus drivers selling the ticket on board the bus. But that's only if it's at the first station. So for example, the first station for the Sorrento to Amalfi town bus starts in Sorrento. So I saw the bus driver selling tickets in Sorrento on board the bus. But that is not the rule. That's more of an exception. I have personally also experienced where I was trying to take the Sita bus very early in the morning, and the tobacco shops were not open yet, so I couldn't purchase a ticket. So I tried to purchase a ticket from the bus driver when the bus driver arrived at the stop, and the bus driver said, no, I cannot purchase a ticket on board, and the bus driver would not allow me to ride the bus. And so I've definitely been burned that way, so I would not recommend depending on the ability to purchase a ticket on the bus. Try to purchase the tickets in advance before you get on the bus. And a key point to consider too is that you don't have to purchase the ticket the day that you need to ride the bus. If you see a place that sells the bus tickets and you know that you're going to have to take the bus multiple times, just buy a bunch of those tickets in advance. They're not time stamped, so if you buy a ticket buy several tickets 5 days in advance and then use them later, that's totally fine. You don't have to buy it the same day. It's better to just have the tickets available in advance rather than ending up like what happened to me, where you're at the bus station, the bus is there, and you can't get on because you don't have a ticket and the bus driver won't sell you a ticket. Other tips to keep in mind if you're taking the Sita bus: if possible, try to take the bus as early in the morning as possible to ensure that you can get on and reduce the risk of a full bus. I saw many times where people couldn't get on the bus, and bus stops are skipped because the bus is already full and the bus driver couldn't take more people anyway, so then they just skip those stops. And that can be very frustrating when some of these buses only come once an hour. So if possible, try to catch the earlier bus in the day if that works for your schedule. The bus starts and ends in Sorrento and Amalfi. So for some of these other towns, you would have to get off in Amalfi and then transfer to a different bus. It's easier to get a seat and get on the bus if you're taking or catching the bus at one of these terminal stations. So for example, Sorrento or Amalfi. Again, buy the tickets in advance so that you have them readily available, because most likely the bus driver will not be selling you any tickets on the bus. To summarize, here are the pros and cons of riding the Sita bus. The pros are that the tickets are very inexpensive. There is space for small luggage above the seats and larger luggage under the bus. It's actually also a very scenic ride to get from Sorrento to Amalfi on the bus. You have some beautiful cliffside and water views while riding the bus along the Amalfi Coast. The cons are that the lines can be very long and can be rather disorganized. The buses might not come on time. If the bus is full, then you would have to wait for the next one, and this can be a regular occurrence during popular times due to narrow roads that can generate traffic. You might have to stand when on the bus if there's no seats available. The bus drivers do allow people to stand in the bus if there's no seats. It's not recommended to ride the Sita bus if you have motion sickness issues. And that's because the road to Amalfi Coast is very windy, and I definitely saw multiple people who experienced motion sickness while on the Sita bus. For the ferry, like I mentioned before, there are many different companies that provide this service. You can buy the tickets in advance, or you can purchase them at the pier same day or in advance at the pier as well. It's usually not necessary to buy the tickets in advance unless it's a really busy tourist season. And it might not be great to buy tickets in advance in the sense that ferries can be canceled due to poor weather and choppy water. And if you bought the tickets in advance and the weather ends up being bad that day, you then have to go through the hassle of seeking a refund. Depending on the destination, it's usually about 10 to 20 euros per person each way on the ferry. The ferry also provides a very scenic ride, so you're not missing a ton by taking the ferry versus the Sita bus in terms of having a great scenic ride. And another positive of the ferry is that there are restrooms on board, and as far as I can tell, the restrooms are actually fairly clean. And for me, as someone who actually gets motion sickness on roller coasters, for example, I did not find motion sickness to be an issue when I rode the ferry many times while visiting Italy. But maybe that was because I was lucky and the waters were calm, I didn't ride the ferry when the water was super choppy. Usually that's because they cancel the ferries if the weather conditions are bad and the water is super choppy. But anyway, I didn't really have any issues with motion sickness when riding the ferry. If your main destination is Positano, here's some additional information about that. So if you're taking the Sita bus, there are 2 main stops for the bus in Positano. The stops are Chiesa and Sponda. So Chiesa is at the top of Positano, and I say the top because Positano is a vertical town. It's very steep, so get ready to climb a lot of stairs and hills. Sponda is at the bottom of Positano. Depending on where your lodgings are or where you're trying to get to, you can kind of decide which of these stops work best for you. You can easily Google Map and see where that bus stop is relative to where you are wanting to go. If it's equidistant and doesn't make a difference to you, I would recommend getting off at the Sponda bus stop. And that's because Sponda leads you more directly into the center of Positano. Also, it's a very scenic walk on a sidewalk into the center of Positano from the Sponda stop. And once you get into the center of Positano, there are more local buses that you can take within Positano itself. So the local buses within Positano are called the Mobility Amalfi Coast buses. And these buses make many stops around Positano. So if you didn't want to climb stairs and hills, you could take these Mobility Amalfi Coast buses. As I mentioned, you get a very scenic view if you are getting off at the Sponda bus stop and walking into the center of Positano. So this is an example of the beautiful view you could have if you were walking into the center of Positano from that bus stop. Isn't it beautiful? It was an overcast day, but still, it was very scenic to make that walk. If you are planning to take the internal bus, aka the Mobility Amalfi Coast buses, the Piazza del Mulini could be a convenient stop for you to go to catch the bus. That stop is located in the center of a town, and it's across the street from a tobacco shop where you can easily purchase your tickets. The nice thing about the Mobility Amalfi Coast bus is that you can actually purchase the ticket on the bus. It even says so on the website. So you don't have to worry about the bus driver not willing to sell you tickets if you didn't have one. The tickets are slightly more expensive if you purchase it on the bus versus purchasing it in advance from, for example, a tobacco store. So for example, if you bought it from a tobacco store in advance, it's $1.30 for euros each way. Whereas if you bought it on the bus, it's $1.80 in euros each way. And do keep in mind that if you are bringing large luggage onto the bus, the luggage requires its own ticket. The buses are quite small. They're kind of like a small shuttle bus type of style of bus, and that's really necessary because the roads in Positano are extremely narrow. The bus schedules are posted at all the major stops so that you can take a look at those to get an idea of when the buses might come. I don't necessarily expect the buses to come completely on time, but at least it gives you a general idea of how often the bus would come to that stop. And when you're in Positano, look for the fermata signs. Those indicate the bus stops. If you are choosing to stay in Positano at a hotel or bed and breakfast, you definitely want to take a look at the exact location of it relative to the rest of the town. Because I made the mistake of not realizing that the bed and breakfast I booked was not actually within Positano proper, which made it rather difficult to get between the center of town and my bed and breakfast. So to check if it's within Positano proper, what you want to do is, when looking at Google Maps for Positano, look for the light yellow area. I'll show you what that looks like in a couple minutes. It's important to stay in Positano proper because that area has actually sidewalks along the one-way roads. If there's no sidewalks and there's very narrow roads, it can make walking around very dangerous because the roads are already narrow and there's kind of high-speed traffic along that busy road and there's no sidewalk. You kind of have to flatten yourself along the wall sometimes to make room for the cars that are coming by. So being in the light yellow area, which indicates Positano proper, ensures that you actually have a safe sidewalk to walk on. So don't do what I did by booking it outside of Positano proper. So avoid booking lodging along the road called SS163 because, like I said, that's the really busy road that's kind of narrow and has a lot of traffic and no sidewalk. Here's what it might look like if you search for Positano on Google Maps. Like I said, look for that light yellow area to be where you're lodging to be located because that's the area that has the sidewalks. The darker yellow is that SS163 road that I was telling you about. I would recommend avoiding lodging that's along that road. If you do end up visiting Positano or other places along the Amalfi Coast, I highly, highly recommend the Path of Gods hike. Really, it's a must-do. It's an easy to moderate hike that most people can accomplish. There are some rocky areas and rocky steps, but for the most part, it's a very doable hike. On the signs, when you're looking for the hike, you want to look for these Italian words that are listed on here. I don't want to mispronounce them, so I'm just going to have you look at these words. But that's the Italian name for the hike, which means Path of Gods. It's best to do the hike in the morning or near sunset to avoid heat and crowds because there's not too much tree cover along the hike. And so when it's hot out and the sun is high up in the sky, it can be uncomfortable. There is one section of the hike that's kind of in a more forested area, but it's not a significant portion of the hike. If hiking in the evening, you would likely want to stay overnight in Positano due to the ferries not running at night. You could consider taking the Sita bus back to Sorrento if you're doing the hike later in the day. However, those buses could be really packed and there's no guarantee that you can get on the bus if you're trying to take a later bus. So keep that in mind for planning. And the reason I say that this hike is a must-do is because of this jaw-dropping, beautiful view that you get on the hike. And honestly, you get to have this view for the majority of the hike, probably I would say 75% or so of the hike. So it's really, really worthwhile. I can't stop even looking at the picture because it's just so beautiful. And you can experience it yourself if you go on this hike. If you are going to do the Path of Gods hike, here are my recommendations for how to go about it. The classic route is to do it as a one-way hike to start in Balmerano and end in Nociel. There are some alternatives that you can tackle instead. So for example, alternative number 1 would be to do a round-trip hike from Balmerano or a round-trip hike from Nociel. The thing to keep in mind about Balmerano is that it's not the easiest starting point to get to. So in order to get there, you would have to, for example, transfer from Positano to Amalfi, the town of Amalfi, via bus, for example, or via ferry. And then once you get to Amalfi, the town itself, not to be confused with just the name Amalfi Coast, because there is actually a town on the Amalfi Coast called Amalfi. So once you get to Amalfi, then you have to take a separate bus or taxi up to Pomerano, which is the start of the hike. So that separate shuttle from Amalfi to Pomerano, I think, is about 50 minutes or so on a windy road. So keep that in mind when it comes to your time calculations for your schedule. So alternative number 2 is you can also start in Priano. If you start in Priano, you would have to walk up about 1,000 steps or so to reach the Path of Gods. And then once you reach the Path of Gods, you can then end in Nociel, or you can make it a round trip hike. And once you reach the end of the hike, go back to Priano, or even go further to Pomerano. So Priano is kind of halfway or so estimated point of the hike. So that's why I mentioned that you could, when you do a round trip from Priano, end up in Priano or end up in Pomerano. And if you did do a round trip from Nociel, you can get to the start of Nociel by using one of those internal Positano buses that I was talking about, the Mobility Amalfi Coast bus. So yeah, from Nociel, you also have several options. So once you end in Nociel, for example, with a hike, you can walk down about 1,700 steps to this little area near Positano, and then walk on the busy road for about half a mile to reach Positano. Option 2 is that when you end the hike in Nociel, you can walk a longer, more gradual path to Monte Pertuso, and then down some steps to Positano. That one does increase the overall distance, but it's less of a steep decline. And then option 3 is you can actually take the shuttle from Nociel to Positano. And like I mentioned, you can actually just buy the bus ticket on the bus when you reach Nociel and catch it to the center of Positano. All those different options for visiting the Amalfi Coast and completing the Path of Gods hike might seem a little bit overwhelming. So here I have outlined my recommendation for your perfect Positano trip. I would recommend using Sorrento as a base because, again, lodging along the actual Amalfi Coast in the little towns can be quite expensive. So if you use Sorrento as your base, you can take the Sita bus to Amalfi town in the morning, and then you take the bus from Amalfi to Pomerano, which is again about a 15-minute ride to the trailhead of Path of Gods. Then you hike the Path of Gods, which takes about 2 to 4 hours one way, and is about 3.5 miles. So it's 2 to 4 hours one way because it really depends on how fast you want to approach this hike. So then you end up in Nociel for the end of the hike, and then you catch a shuttle to the center of Positano and get to explore Positano for a few hours before taking the ferry from Positano back to Sorrento. And I recommend taking a ferry at the end because, like I mentioned before, later in the day, the Sita buses can be really overcrowded. There's no guarantee that you'll get on. You might end up having to wait hours before you can get on the bus. So I think it's worth paying a little extra so that you can just take the ferry back to Sorrento instead. And that way you get a different view on the way back. And here's an alternative for a perfect Positano trip. So still using Sorrento as the base, you can take the Sita bus to Positano in the morning and get off at the stop called Cisanova. And then from there, you can take the internal Positano bus that's called the Mobility Amalfi Coast to Nociel. And from Nociel, you can hike the Path of Gods as a round trip hike. As a round trip hike, it might take 4 to 8 hours to complete, or about 7 miles. This might sound daunting, but actually it's not that bad in the sense of when you're doing the hike, the hours pass by without you even realizing it because you're so distracted by the beautiful scenery all around you. And so if you did do this round trip hike, you would then end up back in Nociel, and you can take the shuttle into the center of Positano to explore it. and then at the end of the day, take the ferry from Positano back to Sorrento. So this is an alternative option if you want to do a round trip hike. A few other tips to keep in mind to help you to optimize your time in the Amalfi Coast. The towns along the Amalfi Coast are quite small. For example, Amalfi Town is one of the largest towns on the Amalfi Coast, and that can be explored in honestly 1 to 2 hours. Atriani is also a cute little town next to Amalfi, and when I say next to it, you can literally walk to Atriani in 10 minutes from Amalfi. And that to access Atriani, there's actually a nice handy tunnel for pedestrians to walk in to get over there. I would recommend using the tunnel rather than walking along the busy road. So to access the tunnel, just look for signs for Atriani when you're in Amalfi. Ravello is also a cute town on the Amalfi Coast that can be visited. This one you would have to reach by either taxi or catching a different Sita bus from Amalfi Town. So when you get off the Sita bus in Amalfi, just look for a different Sita bus that says it's going to Ravello so that you can head to Ravello from there. Priano is another town that some tourists like to visit. You can actually visit that by taking the Mobility Amalfi Coast shuttle from Positano, or if you're already on the Sita bus from Positano, the Sita bus does make a stop in Priano as well when you're trying to reach Amalfi or vice versa. Some final thoughts. I really don't think it's necessary to stay in a town in the Amalfi Coast. The lodging can be very expensive. Bed and breakfasts can be a comfortable and more affordable alternative, but even those are $200 to $300 per night during the low season. Because of the different public transportation options in the form of buses and ferries, I think it really would be more affordable and comfortable for you to just make your base be in Sorrento. You can easily visit these towns within an hour or two, so you can definitely do these as day trips. And overall, I would say that Positano is prettier than Amalfi if you're trying to decide which town to visit, if you can only visit one town on the Amalfi Coast. Positano does have more hills, for sure, than Amalfi, but I think it's prettier. But that's just my opinion. I hope the information from this video will help you to have the best time possible when visiting the Amalfi Coast in Italy. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoy my video, please subscribe so that you can see more of them. Thank you.